live? Okay. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Wayne Shulman, board member in charge of adult education, and I'd like to thank you all for coming. Today we're going to be hearing Keep talking? Is that better? Okay. I have to start over again? What? Can everybody please take your seat? We're going to start today's afternoon's program. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome. Thank you for coming and joining us this afternoon. I'm Wayne Shulman, board member at Coltickford, in charge of adult education. And this afternoon we're going to be hearing from Dr. Stephen Windmueller, who is an emeritus professor of Jewish communal studies, is currently serving as the interim director of the Zilkow School at the Jack H. Skirball campus of Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles. You say that on an empty stomach. Prior to coming to HUC, Dr. Windmueller had served on the staff of the American Jewish Community from 1969 to 1972, directed the Albany, New York Jewish Federation from 1973 to 1985, and the JCRC, Jewish Community Relations Committee of the Los Angeles Jewish Federation from 1985 to 1995. During his tenure at the college, Dr. Windmueller served for 10 years as the director of its School of Jewish Nonprofit Management, and in 2005 was named the deanship of the LA campus from 2006 to 2010. The author of 4 books and numerous articles, Professor Windmueller holds a PhD in political science from the University of Pennsylvania. His research has been primarily focused on Jewish communal needs, anti-Semitism, and Jewish political behavior. His articles have appeared in number of secular and Jewish publications. He recently served as the editor on a volume of USC's Kasdan Institute examining the impact of Donald Trump's presidency on American Jews. Dr. Windmueller serves as a fellow of the Jerusalem Institute of Public Affairs and as a board member of the Pat Brown Institute at Cal State Los Angeles. For the past 6 years, he has been on the faculty of the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Cultural Teaching across the globe. Let's all welcome Dr. Stephen Windmueller. Thank you.
Thank you. Happy New Year, Gamar Tov. Thank you, Rabbi, for inviting me and Wayne for welcoming me. As the Rabbi has indicated, the hour we spent together on Israel is designed in a sense to connect this important thematic issue of our people to the overall sort of storyline of this day and our lives. Israel-diaspora relations is a particularly powerful piece to our scenario. Since 1948, now literally 75 years, we've had the occasion to sort of pause and encounter what Israel may mean to us, for us, with us. There is no irony on the fact that here on the Bima is the flag of the State of Israel. But that just didn't happen in synagogues automatically. That was actually a battle in many places. As the storyline of whether or not Jews would be comfortable dealing with Israel and the question of dual loyalty. Were we more engaged with the United States as its citizens or with a Jewish state? External to our own lives, but yet important emotionally, psychologically, and certainly religiously. So the decision to embrace the flag is in part our accommodation and our comfort with becoming part of understanding that this is not dual loyalty. This is a matter of really relationship, connection, the Jewish people's history and story. We're living in an extraordinarily challenging moment in time, needless to say. It is a moment in time where we see a war in the Ukraine. We see extraordinary challenges and threats in the Middle East, primarily driven by Iran, but also tied to other factors as well. We see a world that is trying to sort through where and how it moves forward, dealing with economic and political challenges of all types. And Israel is a kind of capstone, an almost miniature portfolio of all of this. Its storyline of what is happening internally and externally are really quite significant. Israel faces the third, in 3 years, its fifth election. Wow, that's an extraordinary moment considering that Israeli politics had been, for most of these 75 years, consistently sustainable and understandable and certainly a rhythm to it. But that is not the case over these past number of years. Emulating the sort of political uncertainties of the world, Israel faces this challenge today. On November the 1st, Israelis will vote and will yet again vote for a new Knesset, the 25th Knesset of the state, and will be voting, obviously, for its prime minister. And as we know, the reality of Israeli politics is such that with 120 members in the Israeli Knesset, one group of parties, not one party, but one grouping of parties, will need 61 seats to govern. And in each of these past elections, literally only 61 votes were secured by one faction or another. So what will happen now will be extraordinarily critical. Will we see the return of Bibi Netanyahu to power? Or will we retain the leadership of Prime Minister Lapid? That is the challenging question. And the polling data in Israel as of last week says it's basically too close to call. And literally as Likud, which is the party of Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, is likely to garner 30, maybe 32 seats. And the party of the Prime Minister, Lapid, is likely to draw something on the order of 24 to 26 seats. So that clearly doesn't bring us to 60 plus. So coalition building will be the challenge as both political groups begin to work through that, even now, even before the election. The challenge on the political left and right in Israel is, as with the United States, an extraordinarily complex issue because these are not simply right and left issues. These are questions about security, terror, about economics, about culture, about what is the Jewish state, or is it a state of Jews? So all of this will be part of the scenarios over these next 6 weeks or so before the election. Interesting notion here. 20% of the Israeli vote is comprised of Israeli Arabs, 20%. And that 20% will determine the outcome of this election. We pretty well know where the Orthodox religious parties are and how many votes they will secure. We know where Shas will be in terms of its capacity to garner votes among Jews from Arab lands who now live in Israel. We have a good sense of where the mainstream or middle parties are in terms of garnering secular Israelis. But what we don't know is the number of Arab voters that will show up, the kind of voting they will participate. Will they support the Arab bloc, or will they split, as others have done in the past, and divide their vote accordingly? That will be the determination of the outcome of this election. So the irony here is that Israeli Arabs will define the next Knesset, the next leadership of the State of Israel. Principle number 2, the war in the Ukraine is profoundly significant to the State of Israel. It is significant in the context of the role Israel plays. And if you've noticed, the government of Israel has not formally made strong statements in support of the government of the Ukraine. That's with profound realities of what Israel faces. Israel has a long-standing relationship with Moscow. And what is that relationship about? It's about Syria, and it's about Iran, and it's about being able to balance Israel's interests in the Middle East against what's happening in the Ukraine. meaning it needs Russia to put pressure on the Syrians and the Iranians in terms of Israeli security concerns. So it is no secret that Israel, on a regular basis, is running bombing raids in Syria, knocking out Iranian targets and proxies. This is the major challenge for Israel. Therefore, it has had to defer on the Ukrainian issue in order to preserve its security dealing with Russia and Iran. A second piece to that story, which is not told to you in the media or press. Since the war in Ukraine broke out last February, 165,000 Russian Jews have left Russia who were opposed to that war or who had trouble with the notion of their sons and daughters being conscripted for military service. So the interesting storyline here is not only that Ukrainians are coming to Israel, being resettled and absorbed, but also Russian Jews in significant numbers. Another part of this scenario has to do with the reality that the Abrahamic Accords signed in 2019 are important to this day and time precisely because the Israelis have developed these extraordinary connections with the Gulf states. Now you would ask me, is Saudi Arabia a part of this? Not yet. It remains a silent partner as the other Gulf states address the issues and concerns of security. And what do they share in common with Israel? Their concerns over Iran. What do they share in terms of strategic interests? The concerns that should the Iranians continue to bolster their support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, for the efforts in the Gaza Strip to mobilize and attack Israel through various means, and by creating along the Syrian-Israel border pockets of also potential challenges to the state of Israel. So these are all security and political concerns that bind together the Gulf states with the state of Israel. We sometimes forget that Israel is the second largest nation in the world in terms of startups. Outside of the United States, Israel is creating more new businesses and more new technological advances than any other society in the world, often lost. It is also amongst the major countries in the world in terms of creating opportunities for business connections across the globe. So China, Europe, the United States, and others are deeply invested in Israel or investing with Israel in the new technologies, especially desalination or questions related to a variety of social media and new industries associated with the social platforms. So we are in a moment in time where Israel economically is extraordinarily influential and powerful, but also at a moment in time where we see Israel facing these huge challenges in terms of its international position and the threats to that position, whether from Iran or a destabilized Lebanon, Syria, or Iraq. All of these contain potential problems for the state of Israel. So it was no secret that last week, the government of Lebanon aligned an agreement with the state of Israel, brokered by the United States, that will allow for joint drilling in the Mediterranean for new gas lines, new gas resources. This has value to the Europeans, it has importance to the United States, and it solidifies a place of beginning to create a relationship with Lebanon. As you may or may not know, almost daily now, the United Nations is reporting that Lebanese citizens are crossing into Israel. Why are they doing so? Precisely because Lebanon is in total economic collapse. So the decision last week to create this new economic stream is in part designed to help Lebanon regain some of its foothold and to offset the influence of Iran in Lebanon and to create some stability in a neighboring state to Israel. Israel's relationships in the region continue to be significantly important, especially the Egyptian-Israel relationship. Egypt continues to be the central broker in relationships related to the questions of the Palestinians and the Gaza Strip. And it is the Egyptians that have negotiated and helped negotiate a kind of ongoing truce to a very complex and very unstable environment. Jordan becomes important in the context that it is a silent partner with Israel in a number of security matters. And despite the fact that the publicity here is minimal, Israeli intelligence consistently feeds Egypt and Jordan and other Middle Eastern partners in terms of information about Iran and other potential threats to the region. So as we gather on Yom Kippur, all of this is profoundly important in understanding the place that Israel plays in our lives, in the society and world in which we find ourselves, and especially in the context of this current conflict with the Ukraine. I want to take us for a few moments somewhere else, back to Los Angeles. As many of you know, the Los Angeles Jewish community just completed a population study, and it indicates both the numbers and the kinds of Jews and the behaviors and practices of Jews in our city. That deserves a whole presentation unto itself. But what is strikingly important is the data about Israel and Los Angeles Jews. First of all, over 50% of us have traveled to Israel. In other words, 1 out of every 2 Los Angeles Jews has been to Israel, which is already an extraordinary statement that even 10 years ago we could not have made that statement. The second is the pride that Jews have in Los Angeles about Israel. Concerns, even if they disagree on policy with Israel, the love and abiding passion for Israel is profound, as reflected in this study. So how many Israelis live in LA? That, too, was a factor the study dealt with. It pointed to the fact that there are 42,000 Israelis living in Los Angeles. And the interesting thing about them is that we had thought those numbers were much larger and more diverse. In reality, the population study points to the fact that 4% of the Jews of Los Angeles County are Israeli. But it points also to the interesting fact that these Israelis are deeply engaged in sort of continuing the connection between West LA, the San Fernando Valley, and Israel, meaning they are often traveling back and forth, containing and committed to maintaining the Hebrew language, Jewish culture for their children, and the fact that so many of these families indicated in this study that Hebrew language is spoken in 85% of the homes of Israelis living in LA County. The study tells us also a great deal about the rest of us and its profound importance in terms of understanding who we are. We're 550,000 Jews living in households where we have partners and friends who may not be Jewish. So the total population base of the LA Jewish community is 738,000, which means that roughly 150,000 non-Jews are living with, partnering with a part of the Jewish community in LA. We have 132,000 children, of whom 89,000 are being raised singularly as Jewish, meaning that's their religion. Another 20,000 are being raised as Jewish and something else. So we have a really interesting community in the fact that we are very diverse. We have a significant LGBT community of 6%. Jews of color account for 8%. So it's defining for us that we are a community of great, complex diversity, which creates all of the challenges of where do we come down together, where do we find common ground together. And the interesting thing is both the study and everything else we know about our community suggests that one of the abiding points of connection is Israel, which is an important understanding, even if we, as I suggested earlier, disagree about some of its policies and politics. But we find this basic point. I'm going to close with a few observations that hopefully will be helpful for our conversation in the time that remains. Principle number one is that the Jewish community here and in Israel is going through vast changes. In Israel, we see it in terms of this instability of its politics. Here, we see it in the context of communities struggling to figure out how do we fight anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism, how do we manage diversity and complexity in a society where we have very minimal common ground at the moment amongst all of us. The second principle is that as we come on this Yom Kippur Day, we face this challenge of, so what is happening to Jewish life in North America? Is there a future for Jewish life in the United States? And the profound issue of why we raise that is, of course, all of the challenges that we see around us. 75% of us in this study said that anti-Semitism was of grave concern to us. And significant numbers of us reported in that study and in other studies that they have taken off the symbols of Judaism when walking the streets. Some Jews are even indicating today that they are afraid to come into these kinds of houses of worship, into places where Jews gather, fearing anti-Semitism or some public distraction that could be disruptive or even destructive. So the principle here is feeling this sense of uncomfortability. How do we reclaim our place and our space, not only in the United States, but as we have suggested, both for Israel and for American Jews, a sense of some degree of security and a degree of direction. And the third principle that we need to think about for this day is, so how do we convey to our children and grandchildren the messaging of what it is to be Jewish, to be involved and committed to the Jewish state, to care about the future of Judaism as a culture, civilization, and great religion? And what can we do to, in a sense, ensure this continued character of the Jewish people, which for thousands of years, this is the 5,783rd year of the presence of Jews on the face of the earth, bringing its literature, its culture, its moral values, and its teachings, not just to our own people, but to the civilizations beyond. Thank you. So, Rabbi, I'm prepared to take questions, and you can fire them at me even if you disagree with what I had to say or want me to go further in some of this material. I see a hand over here, but I...
Run over there for the first question. I'll hand it to Wayne, and he can run over there.
First of all, I'm very impressed with your ability to speak about all those numbers with no notes.
It's all here. You didn't see me reading it?
I didn't see it. Then you have very good eyesight. I did want to hear more about former President Trump's effects on Judaism and how that is, whether it's still divisive to our politics.
So now a commercial, Rabbi. October 23rd, on Zoom, USC's Kasdan Institute is sponsoring a conversation on this book that when Dwayne introduced me, he referenced the book, The Impact of Donald Trump's Presidency on American Jews in Israel. And there I'm bringing 5 of my favorite Republicans, Democrats, Independents, and others for a conversation on precisely your question, the impact or influence that maybe the former president has had or is continuing to have on American Judaism. There is no doubt that on the Israel piece, whether you are a Democrat or a Republican, you have to acknowledge the extraordinary impact of some of the decisions and actions during his tenure. whether or not all of that is generated any fundamental change in attitudes about Israel or even hardened attitudes, that remains to be seen. But I think the writers in this volume acknowledged that on the Middle East question, there was no doubt that the Trump presidency was certainly a defining piece of changing some of the issues on the ground within the Middle East. What we cannot figure out and will not know for a while is whether some of those decisions will be ultimately for the good or will create certain challenges or threats, not only to Israel, but to other democracies in the Middle East. So we'll leave some of that to my colleagues and others to deal with on the 23rd, but I acknowledge that the issue is significant and deserves a richer conversation.
Can I just ask you, is Congressman Adam Schiff going to be there?
No, since Congressman Schiff did not participate in the book, he's not part of this dialogue. But you should approach him for his positions and views if you so wish. Well, I'll deliver the second lecture now, since they're...
So you're speaking about the Israelis who live in Los Angeles, and how they retain a connection to Israel, and how they want to teach the children the language. Yet I think historically we've seen that when first-generation immigrants come to this country, they start things like Yiddish theaters, and they have clubs, whether it's Irish or Italian or whatever it is, and they all think they're going to keep that culture going forever and ever. But then soon, by the time you get to the third generation, they are no longer interested in what the first generation expected of them. And so how do we start to look at the Israeli community that lives here now and integrate them in a way that actually will survive? Because I just look at the pattern of history, and I don't understand why they think that, not joining a synagogue or not sending your child to a religious school is actually going to be the way to teach them all about Judaism. So, how does this really work? Are their attitudes really going to fly? Are they going to break the pattern of generations?
Mm-hmm. So, Rabbi, in part, here's some of the outcomes that I think may help us see what you're pointing to. I think very few of us would have thought that of the 40-odd thousand Jews who are Israeli living in greater LA, we would see a significant intermarriage factor. Well, 23% of Israelis are intermarried, meaning outside of the Jewish community.
Is that more or less than the general Jewish?
That's actually lower, but it's still significant. 1 in 4, the Jewish community is basically 42% of all married couples are intermarried. 50% of Israelis living in LA tell us that only half of their friendships are Jewish. So clearly there's an acculturation with American society happening, which we are not seeing, certainly not in our synagogues and certainly not in the general pathways we travel when we meet other Israelis or meet other Jewish folks. The other aspect of this is that many of these folks are actually quite religiously traditional. So what we see in the data is the significant number of Israelis who are Mizrahi and Sephardic. And so the tendency is that we have a higher orthodoxy, higher percentage of Israelis going to and participating in the world of American Jewish Orthodoxy than in liberal congregations, which they have far less exposure to in Israel or elsewhere. So we have a major job of trying to sort of introduce liberal Judaism in whatever forms it may look to Israeli populations who otherwise do not know it and are not sure of its authenticity or have no exposure, certainly. So those are pieces to this very complex question of how do we reach them. I see a hand in the back, and the microphone is on its way.
What would you say is the makeup politically of the Israelis who live in Los Angeles?
I thought you would never ask. So the study raises this with all groups, Russian Jews, Persians, and Israelis, among others. And so the data is right here. So approximately a third, actually 36% to be exact, describe themselves as conservative, or I guess politically right of center. 25% define themselves as moderate, liberals 36%, and very liberal 15%, very conservative 3%. So it gives us this cross the board section. But what we know about Persian Jews, Israelis, and Russian Jews is that their politics tend to be a bit more conservative than mainstream so-called American Jews. So this doesn't surprise a lot of us who've studied political behavior of different ethnic groups, that Israelis would tend to be a bit more conservative than the national average. I mean, we overall believe that roughly 70% of American Jews describe themselves as moderate to liberal, and 24 to 25% describe themselves as conservative or very conservative.
Just to follow up on that, now does that break down with what type of Judaism they practice?
Okay. So as I said with the rabbi's question, that we see a much higher percentage of Israelis who are religiously connected to Orthodox institutions, and therefore it skews their orthodoxy as a higher percentage than we would see amongst most of LA's Jews. But even having said that, we have a significant part of the Israeli LA population that are non-religious, secular. And that too ascribes to what we see in Israel, where we have these two worlds that are really quite distinct, and both politically and religiously show, vast differences in attitudes. Yeah.
So you're saying that it's possible that Netanyahu could return to power in Israel, his party, and what does this say about Israel?
So I will leave the latter part of the question to everyone's opinion as to what it may mean. But clearly, the former prime minister has a particularly good chance to win the November 1st election. And again, one has to understand three factors that I think drive Israeli voters. Sense of security is one. The sense of the economic sort of character or status of the country is two. And third, the sense of really the state of political relationships abroad with the United States, with Russia, with Israel's neighbors. It is no accident that the current prime minister at his UN speech 2 weeks ago spoke about a two-state solution. He was trying to drive a case for his re-election in that speech on the basis that he's still in the game for figuring out a way forward for a two-state arrangement. Knowing full well that his opponent, Bibi Netanyahu, does not and is not committed at this moment, and certainly the right-of-center parties are not committed at this time to a two-state formula. So what we are seeing, both by the decision to present that position at the UN by the Prime Minister, the decision on his part to sign the agreement with Lebanon over petroleum rights, and what we're likely to see in the next several weeks in terms of other actions by the government in power, is all designed to position themselves as different from as against the views of Bibi Netanyahu to sort of frame an alternative way forward. The challenge for the current government is particularly dramatic around the issue of terrorism and security. This has been a very difficult year in Israel for security. The number of incidents, both in the country but also in the West Bank, have been profoundly important, and that has been used by the opponents of the government to say they are not committed to or have not done a good job in securing the country at this time. And that will be a challenging issue. The economy is a second one. Israelis have a huge income variation between the very wealthy and the very poor. And that has grown only more defining, if you wish, in the last several years and certainly in the last few months with inflation. So it is really all very challenging and all likely to be issues that people will vote. As they think about their choices, they will think about security, economy, as certainly very core to their future.
Could you comment on the use of anti-Zionism as a mass form of anti-Semitism and the increase of this usage over really the period of the pandemic?
What I think we are seeing is that the university world is where a lot of this is playing out. And more of it is more profoundly evident there, whether it's fraternity houses that have been violated by anti-Semitic markings, or whether it's votes taken by the BDS movement to isolate Israel, or whether it's in other forms of behaviors on campus by students and sometimes by faculty. So that's been particularly challenging. And it has accelerated during the pandemic, in part because there were fewer ways by which the administrations could counter some of this, because lots of things happened on Zoom as against in person. And as a result, also of the fact that you have increasingly a growing number of people who have grown up with a very particular image of Israel, negative image from social media, that has fed and grown this anti-Israel virus or presence for younger audiences. The impact of that has forced the national Jewish agencies to really invest a good deal of their energy in working with university administrations and in working with social platforms in terms of how do you descale or reduce the untruths or misrepresentations as a way of trying to provide a fair and open marketplace of ideas, not of misrepresentations. I think that it is a problem that will get frankly worse before it gets better. Part of this is going to be how we retool not just civic education in the United States, but generally the fact that younger students in our public institutions and universities have had minimal exposure to diversity and multiculturalism and to a richer understanding that Jews are also a minority. Jews have been treated in many publications and in many ways as part of the majoritarian culture. And Jews have described themselves in so many ways as part of the mainstream of America. We made it in America. And so the heightened presence of Jews in the public circles, in the public square, on the one hand is an extraordinary blessing for our community. People are recognized as journalists and politicians, as thinkers, as philosophers and scientists. But on the other hand, it points to Jewish power and Jewish influence and the perspective that if you're Jewish, you're somehow tied to the cabal of the Jewish story or the Jewish capacity to sort of deliver something because it's designed as something from Jerusalem or whatever the scenarios may be in the social media. So we have a huge job in terms of the re-education of a new generation about who we are and how we fit in with other minorities and how, in fact, minority cultures really define the United States. And, you know, in 25 years from now, the United States will be a country made up in its population of all of these diverse cultures that will be dominant. So it's no longer just a white American Protestant world, but Latinos and Asians and African Americans and Muslims and Jews. And all of that will be the defining new majority. And that's scary to some people, which is why we see pushback. But it is also the reality of what is happening in our society. And we have a job to do to sort of figure out how do we educate all of these groups, both those that are part of the new minorities, but those who are still part of the white culture, to fully understand the storyline of how Jews fit into the American equation.
Given the structure of the American Jewish community right now, don't the majority of American Jews view themselves as really part of white culture? And that is more primary than any Jewish identity they actually have. So when we as a greater community view ourselves more as part of the majority, then how can we also then declare we have minority rights?
Okay, Rabbi. You won't get me on that one, but it's a great question. Our enemies also define us as white. The radical right says to us, you're pretenders. You're trying to be white. You're trying to take over the white Anglo-Saxon establishment. You will not replace us. In Charlottesville was exactly their idea of what they see as white supremacists about who and what we are becoming. But on the far left, we see the same. There we are seen as, you claim to be minority, you claim to be a victim of history, but you play a role that is powerful and influential. And therefore, you lose your status as a minority. You become part of the white mainstream culture. So whiteness has become a new sort of code word for who and what we represent. So it's particularly challenging. And in many ways, the Jewish community has become successful precisely because it is played by the rules of the American story, which is, you know, from the bootstraps up to prove yourself, merit, integrity, education, intellectual curiosity, and so forth. And that price is now challenging us, that tagline of having made it in America. Because can we really claim the status of being a minority any longer? And yet, how do we still defend and protect the interests as a community that we have while growing our larger agenda of also being interested in the welfare of the society in its broadest terms? So this is a particularly challenging moment in terms of Jewish political construct, how we sort of figure our way forward. And I'm not sure we have yet figured out our answers. We just know that we are being seen in a way that is unfitting and problematic to our well-being, and that is going to be particularly challenging. I think I've done it. That's it. Thank you so much for your courtesy of your quality questions and your time.